On the rocky northern coast of Massachusetts, where the Atlantic winds met the quiet streets of Rockport, there stood a small house that looked ordinary from a distance. Its frame resembled any other New England cottage, with a peaked roof, white trim, and a front porch shaded by pine trees. Yet those who came closer quickly realized that it was unlike any other home in America. The walls were not made of stone or wood but of tightly layered newspapers, pressed together and polished until they gleamed faintly in the sun. Beneath the varnish, faint headlines and columns of text were still visible, frozen in time. Visitors could trace the faded names of the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and the Christian Science Monitor, their once fleeting words now part of the very structure. It was as if the daily record of human events had solidified into a single monument. The house had been built a century earlier by an engineer named Elis Stenman from Cambridge, Massachusetts. At a time when industrial America was obsessed with steel, concrete, and speed, he had chosen the most fragile material imaginable. To him, paper was not waste but memory. Each page carried a trace of its era, from the aftermath of the Great War to the optimism of the Roaring Twenties. Stenman believed that the same newsprint people threw away could be transformed into something lasting if treated with care and curiosity. So he set out to test that idea with his own hands. The result stood quietly on a hill overlooking the ocean, its walls layered with more than 100,000 sheets of newspaper glued together with a homemade paste of flour and water, then sealed with marine varnish. Rain and salt air should have destroyed it long ago, yet the house endured. It became both a curiosity and a question, a contradiction made visible. How could something meant to be temporary survive for a century? In the early 1920s, the United States stood between the memory of war and the promise of prosperity. The nation's cities grew upward with new factories, railways, and electric lines. Engineers and inventors were celebrated as symbols of progress. The world had become faster, louder, and more confident than ever before. Yet beneath the excitement there was also a quiet unease among those who worked with machines and materials every day. Elis Stenman, a mechanical engineer from Cambridge, Massachusetts, belonged to that generation of builders who admired progress but also questioned its cost. He lived at a time when the rhythm of industry produced abundance and waste in equal measure. Paper mills ran constantly, feeding the country's growing appetite for news. Every morning millions of newspapers landed on American doorsteps, bringing headlines from across the world, and by evening most of them were already discarded. Stenman watched this daily cycle of creation and destruction with curiosity. Each sheet of newsprint carried knowledge, stories, and labor, yet within hours it became a disposable material. The same pages that connected people to distant events ended their lives as ashes or clutter, their value erased almost instantly. For an engineer trained to find purpose in materials, this cycle felt irrational. The modern age prided itself on invention but consumed without reflection. Steel and concrete were shaping skylines, but the humble paper that recorded that transformation was treated as insignificant. Stenman began to wonder if endurance and worth were physical traits or matters of perception. He was not motivated by thrift alone but by a quiet fascination with permanence. Could something designed to last only a day be made to endure? These questions stayed with him as he planned a small summer home for his family in Rockport. It would be built not to impress but to test an idea. For Stenman, the true challenge was not the shortage of materials but the shortage of imagination in how they were used. In an age defined by consumption, he wanted to create something that defied that pattern. Something that proved even the most ordinary object could hold its place in history if given enough care. Rockport, Massachusetts, in the early 1920s was a quiet coastal town shaped by the rhythm of the Atlantic. Fishing boats filled its small harbor, their masts swaying in the salt wind, while granite quarries lined the outskirts of the community. The town's history stretched back to the 17th century, but by the time Elis Stenman arrived, it had become a place of transition. The old industries of stone and fish were slowly giving way to a new kind of economy built on visitors who came from Boston during the summer months. Artists, teachers, and engineers traveled there seeking refuge from the growing noise of the city. They found in Rockport a simplicity that the industrial world seemed to have forgotten. The town's cottages were modest, built from local timber, or the pale granite that gave the coastline its character. Supplies arrived by train or coastal steamer, and most of what could not be quarried or grown nearby had to be shipped from Boston. Lumber prices had risen after the First World War, and imported brick was expensive for an ordinary craftsman. For many residents, building meant improvisation and repair rather than expansion. In this environment, Stenman's decision to construct a summer house out of an unconventional material did not appear entirely irrational. Rockport had long been a place where people experimented quietly with what they had at hand. The cultural atmosphere of coastal Massachusetts also encouraged curiosity and invention. In nearby Gloucester and Ipswich, small workshops produced tools, boats, and early automobiles. The region had a strong tradition of mechanical skill and self-reliance, values that matched Stenman's mindset. The community valued practical creativity more than luxury. A man who could design and build with his own hands was respected, regardless of what material he used. Paper was everywhere. Newspapers from Boston and New York arrived daily on trains and were sold in local stores. They piled up in kitchens, post offices, and general shops, carrying the world's headlines into a town that otherwise moved at the pace of the tide. In an age before radio became common, printed news connected Rockport to the rest of the country. The same pages that told of politics and invention also wrapped fish, lined shelves, and fueled stoves. In this small town surrounded by granite and ocean, paper was both the most fragile and the most abundant resource. It was within this setting that Stenman began to imagine a new use for it, one that would merge the ingenuity of New England with the impermanence of the modern world. The turning point in Elis Stenman's experiment began with a simple observation. Surrounded by piles of old newspapers that had already served their purpose, he wondered what might happen if paper were treated as a material rather than refuse. In his small workspace in Cambridge, he mixed a paste of flour and water, brushed it between layers of newsprint, and left the sheets to dry in the open air. When they hardened, the result surprised him. The paper became light but firm, able to hold its shape and resist bending. He realized that structure, not material, determined strength. For an engineer trained to see possibility in function, this discovery opened a new line of thought. If a few layers could support themselves, what could thousands achieve? He began to imagine a building whose very substance was the record of its time, a house built from words, photographs, and memories rather than from wood or stone. The idea was not to rival traditional construction but to test how form and patience could turn impermanence into stability. In 1922, after purchasing a small plot of land in Rockport, Stenman decided to prove the concept on a full scale. He designed a modest summer cottage for himself and his wife and started construction that year. A simple wooden frame held the roof and windows, while the walls were built entirely of newspapers gathered from neighbors and local shops. He pressed and glued the pages into thick layers, allowing each to dry slowly before sealing it with marine varnish to protect it from moisture. The work was repetitive but deliberate, combining mechanical precision with quiet persistence. Over the next 2 years he used more than 100,000 sheets of newsprint. As the varnish cured, the walls took on a golden hue, and beneath their surface the text remained visible, like fossils of human thought. What had begun as a small test in his workshop had become a standing structure on the Massachusetts coast, a modest house that turned the most disposable of materials into something built to last. Stenman carried out the building process almost entirely on his own, working slowly and carefully through evenings and weekends. The lot in Rockport became a quiet workshop filled with the mix of varnish and salt carried by the ocean breeze. He followed no formal blueprint beyond his own sketches, relying on trial and observation. The frame of the cottage was built from a simple wooden skeleton that supported the roof and windows, while the rest of the structure took shape from layer upon layer of newspaper. He used stacks of local and national papers, including the Boston Globe and the Christian Science Monitor, pressing each page into place with a brush soaked in flour paste. When the sections dried, the paper hardened into a material far stronger than it appeared. Because of Rockport's humid climate, drying required patience. Stenman left every surface open to the sun before sealing it with marine varnish, the same coating used on local fishing boats. The varnish stiffened the layers and gave the walls a faint golden tone that reflected light like polished amber. Beneath the smooth surface, the headlines of the 1920s remained visible, recording stories of political change, invention, and everyday life. The walls became an accidental archive of their era, turning architecture into a form of memory. The work advanced slowly, one section at a time. Stenman measured each wall for balance and weight, ensuring that every layer stayed even. The small cottage gradually took shape as a two-room structure with a peaked roof and porch. When the main construction was complete, he focused on the interior. He built tables, chairs, a desk, and even a piano using the same process. Each piece was made of rolled and varnished newspaper cylinders bound by persistence rather than nails. The piano, though not fully functional, could still produce faint tones when its keys were pressed. Stenman never treated the house as a spectacle. He did not seek attention or recognition. His goal was to discover how far an ordinary material could go when shaped with care. By the summer of 1924 the paper house was finished. It stood quietly on its hill above the sea, simple in form yet extraordinary in spirit, a place where patience had turned impermanence into strength. Rockport was known for its harsh coastal weather, where the wind carried salt from the Atlantic and winters could turn the sea into sheets of ice. The paper house had never been intended as a permanent residence, only a summer retreat, yet from its first year it faced conditions that would have destroyed most fragile structures. Completed in 1924, it endured the full rhythm of New England seasons. Summer heat hardened the varnish, autumn rains soaked the ground, and winter gales swept across the rocky shore. Despite this, the paper walls held their shape. The layers of newsprint, pressed and sealed with marine varnish, resisted moisture and created natural insulation. What had once seemed ephemeral began to show a quiet kind of strength. At first, the people of Rockport regarded Stenman's house with mild curiosity. Many assumed that time and weather would finish it within a year. But as seasons passed and the cottage still stood, curiosity turned to respect. The color of the paper deepened to amber, and the texture grew smooth and firm. Visitors who touched the walls found them hard as wood. The house became a quiet demonstration of how care could defy expectation. By the late 1920s it had survived multiple winters and coastal storms that damaged nearby wooden sheds. Journalists came to see it for themselves and published accounts describing the house as both whimsical and ingenious. Stenman had not built it to attract fame, but his experiment captured public imagination. When the Great Depression arrived in the 1930s, newspapers once again told the story. Amid the economic collapse, the paper house became a symbol of thrift and creativity. In a decade when many families lost their homes, this small cottage represented the idea that security could come from ingenuity rather than wealth. The paper did not dissolve or weaken, it simply aged, absorbing the years like a photograph fading into sepia. What began as a personal experiment ended as a lesson in resilience, standing quietly against time and the Atlantic wind. By the early 1930s the paper house had become more than a local curiosity. Word of the strange cottage built from newspapers spread beyond Rockport, carried by travelers and journalists who visited the small coastal town. Articles began to appear in regional newspapers describing Stenman's unusual experiment, often with a tone of disbelief. Reporters emphasized that the house was not a temporary structure but a standing building that had survived years of New England weather. The idea that something as fragile as paper could outlast storms fascinated the public at a time when the nation itself was struggling with uncertainty. In 1929, Popular Science published a detailed feature on the house, treating it not as a novelty but as an example of practical experimentation. The article described how flour paste and marine varnish transformed ordinary newsprint into a material as strong as thin wood. A few years later, Ripley's Believe It or Not included the paper house in its national column, introducing it to millions of readers. Life magazine and Yankee magazine later featured photographs of the interior, showing the paper piano, tables, and clock preserved in warm light. The medium that once reported history had now become part of it. Visitors began arriving in Rockport from neighboring towns and even from other states. Many came expecting to find a ruin, only to discover that the walls were still smooth and firm to the touch. Teachers brought students to learn how ordinary materials could become extraordinary through patience and care. Architects and engineers studied the structure and wrote to Stenman for details. His replies were brief and modest, focused on his fascination with process rather than fame. His work reflected the spirit of early 20th century New England, where creativity often grew from restraint and necessity. The cultural impact of the paper house extended far beyond its walls. In an age when modern architecture was turning towards steel, glass, and abstraction, Stenman's modest cottage offered a quiet counterpoint. It reminded people that innovation could arise not from invention alone, but from perception, from seeing possibility in the overlooked. The newspapers that once documented progress now embodied it. By the mid-1930s, the paper house stood as both relic and revelation, an enduring message that imagination could be the most lasting material of all. After Elis Stenman's death in the late 1940s, his family chose not to dismantle the small cottage in Rockport but to keep it as it was. They understood that it had become more than a personal experiment, and quietly maintained it for several years until it was opened to visitors as the Paper House Museum. By the 1950s, it had joined the list of New England's most unusual landmarks, drawing travelers who came to see whether a house made of newspapers could truly endure. Inside, the rooms appeared almost exactly as Stenman had left them. The varnish had darkened into a deep honey tone, but the printed words beneath remained legible. Visitors could trace headlines from the 1920s and 1930s, following stories of early aviation, political shifts, and local triumphs. The table in the main room still displayed articles about Charles Lindbergh's transatlantic flight, while the silent piano stood in the corner, its layers of newsprint forming both frame and ornament. Decades of salt air and humidity had not weakened the furniture. The paper fibers, hardened by varnish, felt smooth and strong to the touch. The caretakers of the museum preserved the structure with a light hand. They reapplied protective coatings only when necessary and relied on steady ventilation to guard against moisture. Unlike many historic homes that demanded constant restoration, the paper house aged naturally and gracefully. The same substance once considered perishable had become unexpectedly durable. It stood as a quiet testament to the ingenuity of its maker and to the endurance hidden in the simplest materials. Throughout the 20th century, the paper house continued to appear in travel guides, history books, and design magazines. It attracted artists, engineers, and environmental thinkers who viewed it as an early expression of recycling and sustainable design long before those ideas had names. Tourists often remarked on the faint scent of old ink that lingered in the air, a reminder that the building was not only a structure but also an archive of lived time. Nearly a century after its completion, the paper walls still stood firm, defying every expectation. In a world that measured strength by concrete and steel, the paper house remained quietly alive, proof that even the most fragile creation could outlast its age. The story of Elis Stenman was ultimately the story of a man who turned the temporary into the enduring. His house in Rockport stood as quiet proof that permanence was not always born from strength, but from intention. In an age built on acceleration, where progress was measured by how quickly the new replaced the old, he chose to slow down and work with patience. Every page he glued became an act of resistance against disappearance. The paper house was not a monument to architecture, but to memory, to the belief that meaning could outlast material. What Stenman created outlived its purpose and even its maker. The words printed on those pages had once been meant to inform and then be forgotten, yet sealed within layers of varnish they continued to speak across generations. The building reminded visitors that value did not depend on what something was made of, but on the care and thought invested in it. It also carried a quiet message about modernity. As the 20th century advanced, filled with machines, glass towers, and disposable goods, the small house of paper stood as a contradiction. It showed that innovation could come not from endless invention, but from the ability to see possibility in what others overlooked. Over time, the paper house became a symbol of continuity. It invited people to question the pace of their own world and to consider what they might build that could last not through strength, but through meaning. Its existence suggested that fragility was not the opposite of endurance, but another expression of it. The same qualities that made paper seem weak had allowed it to preserve the traces of a vanished era, Nearly a century after its creation, the paper house remained intact, its headlines fading but legible, its structure still firm. It stood as a living paradox, a home constructed from stories, each one once destined to vanish. Through it, Stenman had proven that time could be persuaded to pause when met with curiosity and care. His experiment became a quiet philosophy, that even the most perishable materials can find immortality when joined by purpose, patience, and belief.